Hi, witches. I'm Blair Bathory, and this is the Something Scary podcast. Thank you so much for being here. Whether this is your first time or you're one of the brave souls who join us every week, we're 1 week away from Halloween. I am so excited. We all get excited for Halloween because it brings the promise of fun, scares, and chaos. For just one night, we all get dressed up and be something else, something we are not. But masks can conceal more than just our faces. They can provide a cover for the truth. It can even hide the darkest of evils. So be sure you can see beyond the mask. First, disguised as the devil, followed by the Korean urban legend, the woman in the red mask. Finally, in our last story, a fit so perfect, it's suffocating. Before we get to our stories, I wanted to ask if you would take a minute to send this podcast to someone you know who loves horror and spooky things, or is excited for this Halloween. We know there are hundreds of podcasts out there, and the biggest influence on what people listen to is what their friends recommend. You can also rate and comment on our podcast on both Spotify and YouTube. So let me know what you think. I read all of your comments and I try to respond to as many as I can. Thank you so much. We are incredibly grateful to all of our listeners around the world. So, want to hear something scary? Unmasking the horror. Be careful what you choose to wear. Some masks cling not just to your face, but to your soul, like in this story inspired by Gonzalaz. Mia couldn't believe her luck when she bought the house. The price was too good to pass up, even with the unsettling knowledge that the previous owner had died inside. In this real estate market, she hadn't cared. The house had character, a kind of eerie charm she adored. It was perfect for her, especially since she discovered an intricately detailed devil mask hidden in the attic. It felt like a sign. Halloween had always been Mia's favorite time of year, and this mask was just the thing to make her the talk of the neighborhood. She decided to go all out and make sure her house was the spookiest on the block. Her costume was perfect, a red devil mask, its mouth twisted into a crooked grin, white teeth gleaming against blood-soaked red skin. 2 horns jutted from the top of her head, and a matching red jumper with a tail completed the look. Mia had marveled at her luck in finding the mask. It had felt as if it had been waiting for her. She even remembered the odd look the real estate agent had given her when she mentioned it. "Be careful with that," he'd said. But she'd laughed it off. As she put the mask on that Halloween evening, a faint dizziness washed over her. Mia shrugged it off as excitement. Halloween always gave her a rush, after all. The evening had gone smoothly at first. Kids and parents alike had complimented her costume. Mia had removed the mask for the shy ones, but most had loved it. Yet, each time she took the mask off, it felt heavier when she put it back on, almost like it was pulling her into it. Her head began to throb slightly, but she pushed the discomfort aside, ignoring the growing unease in her stomach. When the boy in the black hoodie showed up, everything started to shift. "Trick or treat," the boy said. "Happy Halloween," Mia replied, dropping candy into his bag. The boy had stared at her for a beat too long, then raised a hand slowly, pointing at her face. "Welcome back." "Thanks," she said with a confused smile. But as she tried to close the door, his voice dropped, his words like ice.
"We've been waiting for you."
Mia had blinked, her head suddenly swimming. What did he say? The boy didn't repeat himself, but something dark stirred inside her, a fleeting thought about grabbing him, pulling him aside the house. He's just a kid, but wouldn't it be interesting to scare him just a little, she thought. The idea had startled her. It was so out of character. Shaking her head, Mia dismissed it as the adrenaline of Halloween night. As the night wore on, the boy returned again and again. Each time, he wore a different mask, a pumpkin, a clown, a werewolf, and every time, he had said the same thing.
Welcome back. We've been waiting for you.
Each visit left Mia feeling worse. The mask now felt like it was constricting her skull, and more troubling thoughts began creeping into her mind. She started to resent the children that came to her door. Greedy little monsters, she found herself thinking, watching them gleefully grab handfuls of her candy. At one point, she felt a sudden urge to slam the door in a child's face, something she'd never do. But the thought lingered. She could feel her patience unraveling, her normally cheerful demeanor dissolving into irritation. The mask felt impossibly tight, as if it was becoming part of her. By the fifth visit from the boy, Mia's anxiety had turned into something darker. Her head throbbed with sharp pains, and every knock on the door grated on her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Her fingers itched to do something violent. She didn't even know what, but it was there, crawling just beneath her skin. Finally, near 10 p.m., a series of rapid knocks rattled her door. Mia stormed over, ripping the mask from her head, her pulse racing. This time, she wasn't just going to confront the boy. She wanted to scare him, make him regret playing these games with her. She rehearsed her rage as she flung open the door. But when she opened it, the boy wasn't on the porch. He was standing at the edge of her walkway, his candy bag bulging, his stance still.
Welcome back.
He called out again, his voice louder, more incessant. Mia's blood had run cold as she stepped forward, her foot sinking into something wet. Her eyes dropped to the ground. The boy's candy bag was on her porch, spilling open, drenched in something thick and red. From inside, lumpy shapes pressed against the fabric. Her breath had caught in her throat.
A gift for you.
The boy giggled, and from the shadows, other figures emerged. Small, silent, wearing the same masks she had seen all night. Clowns, skulls, werewolves, all dripping with fake blood. Or was it fake? Mia stumbled back, dropping her mask in shock as they rushed toward her. Small hands had banged against the door, pounding with unnatural strength. She had barely managed to slam it shut, her heart racing. Outside, an eruption of malicious laughter echoed. Shaking, Mia crawled to her phone, hurriedly dialing 911. She had begged for help, and it had felt like an eternity before the pounding stopped and the beautiful sight of blue and red lights appeared outside. The officers calmed her as best they could, but when they escorted her outside, they had warned her not to look at her front yard. But Mia had to know. She had to see. At the end of her walkway, the boy's candy bag was sprawled across the ground, now empty. Its contents, severed heads that had been stacked neatly beside it, each wearing one of the masks she had seen that night. Her devil mask had now joined the grotesque display. Resting atop one of the heads, the horns gleaming in the moonlight, and spelled out in candy at her feet were the words,
Welcome back.
Do you think objects can hold the power of evil? Would you have reacted to the cryptic message sooner than Mia? Do you think you would be self-aware if something sinister was taking over your body and mind? Everyone knows the Japanese urban legend of Kuchisaka Onna, the slit-mouthed woman. But in Korea, there is more evil than just the Kuchisaka Onna. They have their own ghosts who are ready to kill, like in this urban legend. The subway screeched into the station, the empty cars rattling under the dim fluorescent lights. Shuga leaned against a steel pillar, checking his phone for the time. It was 11:43 p.m. His commute was always long, but tonight, the late hour added a layer of unease. Since the pandemic, the subway was usually quieter. But this evening, the platform felt like a tomb, silent and abandoned, save for the faint hum of electricity and the hiss of an oncoming train. Suga boarded the train, slipping into a seat near the door. The car was nearly deserted, just a handful of passengers spread far apart, each clad in masks. His eyes flicked over them out of habit, but something, or rather, someone, caught his attention immediately. A woman sat across from him, a few rows away. Her eyes were bright and wide, fixed on him with an intensity that made his skin prickle. She wore a red surgical mask, a color that stood out vividly against the sea of standard blue or white mask everyone else had. Her hair, long and sleek, cascaded over her shoulders like black silk. There was something familiar in the shape of her face, a kind of beauty that seemed ethereal, unreal even. But the crimson mask, it unnerved him. Suga shook it off, thinking it was just another oddity in a city full of masked faces. With everyone hiding behind their masks, small things became larger than life. The train jolted forward, and he tried to focus on the moving lights outside, but the woman's gaze never left him. He could feel her eyes burning into the side of his head. Nervous, he glanced at her again. She was still staring, her head tilted ever so slightly to the side, and her fingers tapped on the armrest, slow and rhythmic. Suddenly, she stood and walked toward him, her footsteps eerily soft in the echoing car. Suga felt a chill course through his body as she stopped directly in front of him. Up close, her beauty was undeniable. Porcelain skin, dark almond eyes that glistened with a kind of haunting allure. She bent slightly at the waist, her voice a soft whisper beneath the mask. "Am I pretty?" Suga froze. The question felt out of place, almost surreal. The world had changed so much, and yet here she was, asking such a strange thing. He fumbled for words, unsure how to respond. Yes, you're very pretty," he replied, his voice shaky. The woman's eyes gleamed with something unreadable, something dangerous. She reached up slowly, fingers gripping the edges of her red mask. With a sickening pause, she pulled it down. Suga's stomach twisted violently at what he saw. Her mouth, her lips were shredded and mutilated, slashed wide from ear to ear. The raw, jagged lines of flesh stretched into an impossible smile, the corners of her mouth twitching with a grotesque amusement. Blood crusted around the edges of the wound, dark and dried, as if it had been there for ages, but the rawness made it seem fresh, still aching. She leaned in closer, the smell of coppery blood hanging between them. "How about now?" she asked, her voice a cruel echo of before. The slits at her cheeks widening grotesquely as she spoke. Suga's breath caught in his throat, and terror surged through him. His eyes screamed for him to move, to do anything. But his body felt paralyzed under the weight of her gaze. Her smile grew wider, her tongue darting out to lick the blood-stained edges of her mouth, savoring his horror. The subway car rattled on, and suddenly, the door slid open at the next station. The world outside seemed like a distant dream. This was his only chance. Without thinking, Suga bolted from his seat, shoving past the woman. He heard her low, guttural laugh behind him, a sound that sent a fresh wave of panic through his veins. His shoes slapped against the tile of the platform as he sprinted, heart pounding in his ears. He didn't stop until he reached the station's exit, gasping for breath, his mind racing. For a moment, he felt a fleeting sense of safety, but then the subway doors hissed open once again, and he saw her, standing at the edge of the platform, the red mask back in place, but her eyes still burning into his. She didn't chase him, but the weight of her presence clung to him like a curse. Days passed, but Suga hadn't been able to shake the encounter. Every time he stepped into the subway, he scanned the crowd, heart thudding in his chest. Was she still watching? Did she know where he lived? Paranoia gnawed at him, and soon he stopped taking the subway altogether. But the nightmares followed. He dreamt of her every night, her mutilated smile haunting him in the darkness. No matter how far he ran in his dreams, she was always there, waiting, whispering, "Am I pretty?" Weeks later, a chilly autumn evening, Suga sat in a dimly lit cafe, staring blankly at his coffee. The world outside felt distant, muffled. COVID was still present, and masks still covered the faces of strangers. But he couldn't shake the feeling that one of those masked faces, was her. He left the cafe and decided to walk home, avoiding the subway entirely. The streets were empty, save for a few scattered pedestrians. But as he neared a narrow alley, something stopped him in his tracks. There she was, standing at the mouth of the alley, bathed in the flickering glow of a neon sign. Her red mask gleamed under the light, and her eyes, those dark, haunting eyes, found his immediately. "Am I pretty?" she asked again, her voice barely a whisper, yet it echoed inside his skull like thunder. Suga's legs wobbled, fear coursing through his veins. His mouth went dry, but he remembered the stories, the urban legend that had resurfaced in Korea during the early 2000s. If you answered yes, she'd slit your mouth open just like hers. If you answered no, she'd kill you. There was no escape, no right answer, but there was one option: run. Before she could move, Suga turned and sprinted down the street, his breath ragged, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Her laughter echoed in the empty street behind him, rising like a chorus of dead voices, growing louder and louder until it consumed everything. And even as he ran, Suga knew it wasn't over. The lady with the red mask would always be there, lurking behind the masks of strangers, waiting for the next time she could ask, "Am I pretty?" Do you think you've encountered the lady in the red mask? Or Kuchisaka Onna? What is the legend of the slit-mouthed woman in your culture? Tell us about your story by sending us an email at somethingscary@snarled.com. There is a saying that you get what you pay for, but if the cost is your life, it's hardly worth it. Like in this story inspired by Xerxes. Being poor is tough, but it hits especially hard during the holidays. Halloween is the first reminder that you don't have the disposable income for your kids' happiness. I took Austin down to a local thrift store we visited frequently. They had a rack of reject costumes from supermarkets, a few cheap latex masks, corny novelty party hats, and one very well-made green and yellow belly dragon costume. It looked like it could fit Austin and Austin only, sitting alone next to a golf bag full of hockey sticks. The costume was painstakingly detailed. It had scales that shimmered, interlocking like tiny emerald shields, each with its own strange symbol etched into it. The material was hard like crystal, lighter than glass or plastic. It was cute enough to make adults smile, and remarkable enough to finally make my poor son the envy of all the rich kids at his school. Austin jumped into it without hesitation. I couldn't help but admire the craftsmanship. Rubber-soled feet, individual fingers with claws, a lifelike tail and jaw. There were no tags, no seams, nothing to suggest it had been a mass-produced product. It felt almost too perfect. He pulled the head of the dragon over his, his bright smile disappearing behind the black mesh inside the open mouth. He begged me to buy it. It wasn't cheap, at least for us, but it seemed worth it. That was on the 27th, right before Austin went to his first costume party. From the moment he put it on, something changed. He loved the costume, yes, but there was an odd sense of attachment. He wore it the entire day, even after the party ended, and insisted on sleeping in it. I figured it was just the excitement of a new costume. By the next morning, Austin seemed even more attached to it. He wore it while doing his chores, eating breakfast, and even brushing his teeth through the small mesh slot in the dragon's mouth. I remember thinking it was cute, but something about the costume fit him so perfectly, almost too naturally, it nagged at me. When I asked him if he wanted to take it off before bed that night, he simply shook his head, barely looking up from the homework he was doing.
"I'm fine,"
he said, his voice muffled behind the dragon's head.
"I like it."
There was an edge to his voice I hadn't heard before, but I shrugged it off. Halloween night was perfect for Austin. The costume made him the center of attention. Every house we visited was thrilled to see the dragon arrive. By now, it felt like the costume had taken on a life of its own. Austin moved in it like one with the creature. His steps seemed smoother, more fluid, and even his voice had taken on a strange, growly undertone when he spoke through the dragon's mouth. I started to notice he rarely took the head off anymore. Then came the 1st of November. When I suggested he finally take the costume off, his reaction was troubling. He screamed like I'd never heard before, clawing at me when I tried to reach for the zipper. His eyes, peeking out from the mesh, were wild like an animal's, and he thrashed against me, insisting he needed to keep it on. At first, I thought he was just being a stubborn kid, but then I noticed the zipper. It wouldn't move. I tried pulling at it, thinking it was stuck, but it wouldn't budge. The material felt like it had tightened around him. My wife and I exchanged nervous glances, but eventually, after hours of arguing, we gave up. He went to school again in the costume. Over the next few days, Austin's behavior grew stranger. He became quieter, more withdrawn, almost as if he was fading. He hardly spoke at the dinner table, only muttering a few words through the dragon's mouth. I caught glimpses of him staring into the mirror, almost like he was inspecting the costume or himself. There were times when I swear I saw him twitch in ways that weren't human, like his limbs were moving in odd jerks or slithers. I told myself it was just the bulk of the costume making him move awkwardly. When my wife called me that afternoon, saying there was an emergency, my heart sank. I rushed to the school and found Austin lying in the nurse's room, still in the dragon costume. The nurse explained that a kickball had flown over the fence and bounced off a trucker's bumper, hitting Austin in the back of the head. The dragon's helmet had likely saved his life, but now he was unconscious. "We need to get it off of him," the nurse said. She had a custodian try and undo the zippers, but they wouldn't budge. The costume was stuck tight. With a pair of pliers, the nurse clamped onto the zipper and tugged. It came down slowly, like something was holding it in place. As it peeled away, I heard a sound like wet wood splitting, and then we saw it. The space under the zipper wasn't just skin. There was a deep, oozing gash, exposing raw muscle and bone. My wife screamed as the nurse hurriedly zipped it back up, trying to contain the bleeding. The costume had fused with his skin. We followed the ambulance to the hospital, desperate for answers. Hours passed before 2 women and 2 men entered the room, wearing unnervingly clean white scrubs, unlike the usual medical staff. Their bright blue-soled shoes clicked in unison as they approached. They seemed wrong, like actors playing a part, their movements too synchronized, too stiff. 2 minutes later, 2 of them walked out, one carrying the dragon costume, the other holding the head. "Just a little more time and the meal would have been done," one muttered. "Shame." Still, I can't believe they let one of ours get all the way to a thrift store. They ignored us completely, walking down the hall. My wife, in a panic, followed them. I waited at the door for the remaining two. A man exited the room, hurrying past me. The last woman paused, glancing at me. Her smile was too wide, her voice strange and robotic. "He's free now. You're lucky." Then she was gone. The room was empty and Austin was gone too. Have you ever felt that something was too good to be true? What do you think happens when someone is too attached to their possessions? What would you do if you were fused together with your friend? This week's podcast stories were edited by Sarah Lukasiewicz, narration by Blair Bathory, audio edited and mixed by Fitz Harris, additional audio editing by Calvin Linderman, produced by Anna Villalobos, executive produced by Gail Gilman, music by Sapphire Sindalo and Calvin Linderman.